Do you ever feel like you're chasing a moving target, or like being good enough always feels like it's just out of reach? I get it. Growing up with a father who was an addict, losing a parent at a young age, and battling obsessive compulsive disorder throughout my life has taught me much about shame, guilt, and always trying to be good enough. But what if being good enough is a myth? What if your worth is not something to chase or try to measure up to? This is the Enough Effect podcast, a space to rewrite the narrative, share stories, and discover the power of being you exactly as you are. Hello, my fellow I have a bully for a mind people. If you're here, I'm assuming that you can relate to that sentiment. Whether you have OCD or not, you know what it's like to have a brain that's just a little bit mean to you, or a lot of it mean to you almost all of the time. But I'm here to serve you up some harsh truths on a silver platter here in the form of a story of something that I learned a few months ago when I went to visit my in-laws for the first time. I went to the Philippines to meet my in-laws for the first time back in April. I was diagnosed with OCD in December. So it was just a few months period between the diagnosis and the trip, and that few months was extremely rough for me. If you've ever been diagnosed with OCD, you know that your world is like in a whirlwind because you're realizing and like every day you're learning, oh, that's another compulsion I do. Oh, that's another way that OCD interacts with me in my life. And it's overwhelming to figure out how to stop doing compulsions. You don't know what's real and what isn't. You're doubting everything. You're doubting if you even have OCD, and it's a crazy time. So I was struggling a lot, needless to say, before this trip that I went on. And I remember talking with my therapist before I left about how I felt, and then saying, like, all right, sayonara, I'm back. And then literally my first session back from the trip, I said, guess what? Life feels lighter again. And she said, I have whiplash. But I'm gonna tell you what I learned that helped make life lighter again. When I was in the Philippines, I was kind of forced out of my mind in a way. I was getting the same intrusive thoughts. I wanted to do the same compulsions, but I had to be very present in my life because I'm meeting these new family members for the first time, and I'm trying to figure out how to navigate certain things, and I'm surrounded by a different language and new food and different activities. And so I was kind of forced to not be living in here as much, but I guess it showed me what it means to be present. And it's a lot more difficult to do that, I think, when you're kind of in the monotony and the mundane of your everyday life. However, I think that the lesson and the principle can be the same. And I explained this to my therapist. I said, yeah, like I was in this place and in this world where I didn't have to be living in my head all the time. And she said, oh, okay, but you were still getting the same thoughts, like you still had OCD, right? And I said, well, yeah, I did. But like I already explained to you, I had to be in the world. I had to be present. I had no other choice. And she said, well, but you did have a choice. So how are you responding to those thoughts? Because you still had to respond to them. You could have just ignored them, right? And I kind of got confused for a second. Because if you have OCD, you know, you can't just ignore your thoughts. If you get an intrusive thought, you can't just be like, I didn't hear you say that. I did not hear you say that. You have to address it. And I actually ended up needing to think about that question for quite some time. And then in the next session, I said, I have an analogy. And I've been using it this week because life still feels light, and it's been 2 weeks now. And I'm going to explain that to you right now. And there's a few different variations to see which one clicks with your brain. But I'm going to use the one that I first came up with, and I don't know if it's completely original, but it was original to me when I was experiencing it. And I said, I figured out how to handle the intrusive thoughts without getting sucked into the OCD cycle. It's like I'm standing in this blank room, a room with white walls, there's nothing around me. The intrusive thoughts are being shot at me as arrows, like somebody's holding a bow and arrow and it's shooting it at me from all directions. And normally I would catch the arrow, or it would hit me and I would get stuck into the pain and try to pull it out and pay attention to it. But the past couple weeks, I feel like I picked up a shield that was on the ground. And when the arrow shot at me, I would just let the arrows bounce off of the shield. And I still acknowledged the thought was there because it had to hit my shield and it made a sound. And I just kind of watched it clatter to the ground and said like, oh, like, thanks for the concern, but I don't want to invite you into my space and into my life. And my therapist was like, this is great. You're learning how to selectively choose which thoughts get your attention. And she said, but I don't know if the arrow analogy is really painting the picture of acknowledging the thought, it's more like ignoring it. Like you're kind of scared. Like you're just like, like put up the shield. Don't come near me. It's more of like a fear tactic, because the arrow itself is like the thought can hurt you. The thoughts can't hurt you. So maybe let's try and think of a different thing. Let's think of another analogy we can use where the thoughts don't seem scary and it doesn't seem like a defense mechanism. And I said, okay. And I thought, and then she proposed another idea for me, another way to think about it. She said, what if instead of an arrow, the thoughts were a basketball? And somebody was just tossing the basketball to you, and you didn't like reach up and swat the basketball away. Instead, you caught the basketball, and maybe you looked at the basketball and you noticed the little orange dots or the black ridges. You noticed how the rubber felt in your hand. Maybe you bounced it a couple times and noticed how it hit the ground and the sound that it made. But at the end of the day, you decided not to keep the basketball because there was another one coming your way anyway. So you threw the basketball off. You passed it back to the person, or you threw it off into a corner of the room. And that basketball stayed in the room with you, but you weren't holding it. You just, oh, this is a basketball. And then you threw it off. And I think that's the key, and a much healthier way to look at it rather than a shield, because you can get a thought, I am unworthy. And you can hold that thought with you. Try it out for size, Okay, I am getting a thought that I am unworthy, and you can notice it and call it out for what it is, and then you can choose what to do with it. And you can decide, well, maybe I am unworthy and maybe I'm not, but I value living a life where I show respect and love to myself. And I know that I'm trying, and I'm gonna throw this thought back, this basketball back, and it's gonna stay with me, but I'm not gonna let it internalize into me and affect me. And that's how you enter a space where you're not afraid of your thoughts. That's where great healing occurs, when you can just be open. You can be open to the vastness that is your mind and to what messages pop up in there, and realize those messages don't even necessarily come from you. They are not based on fact. They are just meaningless things that only have meaning when you assign it meaning. The thought, I am worthless, is just a thought until you decide you are. Until you accept it. You can get the thought, I am worthless, and feel the ickiness, and then decide, actually, what I value more is wisdom. And I know that it is wiser to not believe I am worthless. So even if I feel worthless, I'm gonna set this thought aside, and it can stay in the room with me because I'm not afraid of it, but I'm gonna act as if I don't believe that. And pretty soon what will happen is your mind will begin to learn that weapon or that arsenal of those thoughts that affected you so negatively and so deeply just doesn't work anymore. And you might still get intrusive thoughts, but they won't be scary, and you'll become a master at choosing who you want to be, what you want to believe and give your energy to. Ultimately, your mind will do what you teach it to do to a certain extent. It's the same with recovering from OCD. You get an intrusive thought that makes you anxious, and you actively must choose not to do a compulsion. That's the same thing as getting a thought and actively choosing not to run down the rabbit hole and make it gospel and take it at face value. And it's hard work. I remember a time in my life where I thought it was a good idea to write down every negative thought that I got about myself, and I was incredibly overwhelmed, and I felt awful because to me, at that time, every thought was true, and I had to untangle it. But now looking back, I realized thoughts are just thoughts. And it's taken a lot of work to get there. But I know that you could do it too, because that's the beauty of being human, is that you are the master of your own self. And no matter whether you have OCD or whether your mind's just mean to you, you have to take responsibility for what goes on in your mind. You can't control it, but you can control how you react to it, and you have to take responsibility for that much. I'm here to remind you that you do have power to choose which thoughts you do and do not give heed to. And I think that thinking of them as a basketball that you can notice and acknowledge and then set down by your feet is the perfect way to do that. Good luck with trying this out. Please let me know if this analogy resonated with you, if you have another way to think about it that you think is even more helpful. And I'll talk to you next time. Thank you for listening to the Enough Effect podcast. If you enjoyed listening, it would mean the world to me if you would subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment your favorite thing from today's episode. Plus, don't forget to hit up my social media at abstabs, ABSTABBS on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook for daily inspirational content to remind you that you can live a life built upon the resounding belief that being good enough was never an endeavor worth pursuing. Lastly, check out my show notes for any resources mentioned in this episode and my website, where you can find a list of all the ways I would love to work with you. See you next week, and don't forget that you are and always have been more than enough.